Hello and welcome to the Convo presented to you by Leadership Indianapolis. My name's Ebony Chappelle, Manager of Programs and Communications, and today I am so happy to be talking with Dr. Leah Gunning Francis of Christian Theological Seminary. She is Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty and Associate Professor of Christian Education and Practical Theology. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Francis. How are you?
I'm doing well, Ebony. Thank you so much for having me today.
Absolutely, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about your work at Christian Theological Seminary. I know that you all have done a lot of initiatives and programming to support the Indianapolis community, and I would like people to know a little bit more about that.
Sure, Christian Theological Seminary is a graduate school for people that are preparing for various forms of ministry and counseling. So we prepare pastors, we prepare community organizers, counselors, mental health workers through our graduate programs. And beyond that, our community involvement extends through programs like our Faith in Action program, where we have received generous donations from the Mike and Sue Smith Foundation to really address the issue of poverty in Indianapolis. And so have been partnering with lots of organizations around Indianapolis to address that really critical issue facing our community.
Yeah, which, is incredible work. I know a lot of times people like to segment parts of our community as if there's not an intersection that combines them all. So I know that you have a career, of course, as a faith leader and as an educator, but you have also been involved in community activism as well, back to the book that you wrote about your time in Ferguson. Talk to us a little bit about navigating all of those fields as a leader in the community.
Sure. I feel very blessed to be able to have the different facets of my vocation be able to come together in the role that I have as a dean, as a scholar, and as a community engager. And so to be able to teach in classrooms, to be able to provide administrative oversight for programming, as well as, speaking. The book that you referenced, my book, Ferguson and Faith, came out of clergy experiences that were happening during the Ferguson uprising for racial justice. And so to be able to hear these stories that many people didn't get to see on the news of what was really going on with faith leaders, with many of the young activists that were really advancing the cause for justice in some very substantial ways, and have gone all around the country talking about those various models, sharing the wisdom that is of it, knowing here we are 6 years later to be right back in that same spot again. So, to be able to bridge all of these interests together for me has been very, very, very meaningful.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that there are other people who have this existence as well. Like, they have so many different facets and sides to them. And in times of, critical things happening in the community, sometimes we just need to rise up and do our part. We are experiencing some things that are very similar to what happened in Ferguson, and it's happening all over the world right now. What advice would you have for leaders, no matter what field they're in, whether it's in local politics or education, civic leadership, nonprofit, etc.? What advice would you have for them on how to navigate this time and serve their community in a very strategic way?
My first recommendation is don't look away. So often we see these kinds of tragedies happen and we're quick to look over them or look around them or look past them and say, oh, that's too bad for them. They have my thoughts and prayers. But this time, we cannot afford to look away. So regardless of the field that you're in, whether it's corporate or education or with faith-based leadership, not-for-profits, everybody has a role in addressing the systemic injustice that is pervasive around our country. You know, I've heard some people say, oh my goodness, it's so surprising to see so many people around the country stand up, you know, on behalf of George Floyd. And I say, you know, people were inspired by what happened to George Floyd in terms of saying that is horrible. But one of the reasons it resonated so deeply is because in every city that you see on the news, there have been very significant incidences of police violence, of police brutality that too often fall right along the lines of race. And so, yes, while the horrific death killing of George Floyd was the catalyst for what we see today, we have to be very clear that the issues that are pervasive in Minneapolis are pervasive in every city, town around the country. And so since that is true, and since from the last movement for racial justice that came out of Ferguson, that you saw rising up during the killing of Trayvon Martin, the young 17-year-old who was merely walking down a Sanford, Florida street, minding his business, was seen by someone who deemed him guilty and a criminal, even though he was just walking, and ultimately killed him and ultimately got off for that. You know, then all of these kinds of incidences have driven people to the point to say enough is enough, that these issues live right here where we are, and they are all of our problem to solve. More specifically, dealing with issues of policing. Since George Floyd specifically, we saw what happened, the very, very tragic killing where, you know, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, he's saying, I can't breathe, and his cries were denied. They went unanswered until he could not speak and breathe anymore. That is just more than people could bear. And so the problem is, it needs to be more than all of us can bear. It needs to be the clarion call to say, yes, we need models of anti-racist policing. What I mean by that is to be able to acknowledge, number one, that the data shows that there is racial bias in policing. That's in the criminal justice system across the board. That's what the data shows. And so since that's a fact, we have to live in our truth and be determined to say that we have to become anti-racist, not just inclusive, not just more diverse, but really doing the work of undoing racism within our systems. So a system of anti-racist policing includes, number one, collecting all the data. And this is for a small town that has, you know, a department the size of 3 people, or a metropolitan city like Indianapolis or New York or Miami. Collecting the data, you know, who's getting stopped? Every time somebody is stopped, not only the reason, but the race and gender of that person, who's getting arrested, and God forbid, worse than that, collecting all of that data. Second, we need to ensure that everybody is undergoing anti-racism training. Again, not just diversity training or inclusion training, but anti-racism, and embedding that not in a 2-hour workshop, but an ongoing process of anti-racism training, starting with the police academy and going all the way through. Third, we must ensure that our policies and practices and procedures for use of force, de-escalation, are consistent to provide the kinds of outcomes where it is highly unlikely for a person of any race, of either gender, to be seriously harmed or, God forbid, killed. That's not the case right now. And again, these incidences still seem to fall along racial lines. So reviewing those kinds of things. Fourth, body cameras. Listen, I can't even believe we're still talking about body cameras. Every police department does not have body cameras, and be required to use them and to have a penalty immediately imposed if they just so happen to not be turned on. No longer acceptable. So these are just a few of the kinds of things that need to happen in every police department, regardless of the size. We first need to not look away. We need to admit that we have racial bias inherent in our system. And third, be willing to do the work to undo it through anti-racist processes.
Thank you so much for that insight and that wisdom. Those are issues that a lot of people really, really are fighting for right now. So we need to keep that conversation going. In addition to the things that are pressing us right now, with policing, as you mentioned, and other things happening around the country, we are still in the midst of a global pandemic. And this has forced a lot of people to dig deep and figure out how to lead effectively in a time when most things are uncertain. As we wrap up, could you give me one leadership lesson that has helped you to survive and thrive during this time?
You know, one of the things that has helped me is to stay connected to what's happening within myself, stay connected to my family and friends and support systems, and stay connected to my faith. You know, those three things really have helped me to keep things in perspective, to stay focused and motivated on those days where you feel like, oh my gosh, there's just no hope here, all hope is lost. And just to keep relying on all of those things to be able to endure and sustain during these very difficult times. For my role as dean, to stay connected to our students, stay connected to our staff and our faculty in very intentional ways. You know, we're employing what we are calling a theology of care. And that means that, you know, every single thing we do needs to be consistent with a theology of care in terms of the mental, spiritual, physical well-being of people, right? Not that we can solve every problem per se, but what are the things that are within our reach to be able to do to employ this level of care during these unprecedented times that each of us are facing. So, you know, those are just some things that I have found personally strengthening for me, that I have found to be very good for our institution and for our staff and faculty and students as we all try to navigate these very difficult waters together.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Francis, again for your time. I definitely appreciate it, and I appreciate each and every one of you for tuning in to this week's conversation.
Thank you so much, Ebony, for having me today.